Hello, thank you for joining our HOME-ARP rental housing development. I am joined today by my co-presenter Les Warner. My name is Alex Pereira. We're both at ICF, and today we'll be covering a number of topics with you. I'll turn quickly to Les to introduce himself.
Warner, I've been with ICF for about 15 years, working on home and CDBG and HOME-ARP and other things. And before that, I worked at state level for 20 years. Alex, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Les. And again, Alex Pereira. I've been with ICF for about a little under a year and a half now. Background in development of affordable housing. So a really quick overview of our agenda today. We will be talking primarily, providing an overview of rental development under HOME-ARP. We'll be talking about some specific challenges that come with that program. We'll cover targeting and qualifying populations, eligible activities, costs, and types of assistance. We'll discuss PJ oversight and management, touch on underwriting and subsidy layering, and that ties with some of the challenges that we'll be discussing. We'll also talk about commitment and unit designation and some of the documentation that goes behind that. And then at the very end, we'll share some resources, either existing or upcoming, that may be helpful to you as you look to develop rental housing under HOME-ARP. So the learning objectives for today, essentially would like you to come away understanding the basic requirements of HOME-ARP, some key considerations there as you think about developing your first rental housing project under the program. Like I mentioned, we will be identifying some of the key challenges and considerations that you should keep in mind, particularly when it comes to ensuring that financial feasibility throughout the minimum compliance period. And we'll also be describing some of the flexibilities that HOME-ARP provides and additional eligible costs when compared to the home program that have been baked into the program to make sure that HOME-ARP projects are able to operate with sufficient cash flow. To give a very brief overview of the rental housing program under HOME-ARP, so the HOME-ARP allows you to acquire, construct, or rehab rental housing for occupancy by individuals and families that meet one of the definitions of qualifying populations. We'll provide a lot more detail by what we mean by acquiring and constructing and rehabilitating, and also what we mean when we say qualifying populations. And just to highlight that several types of housing are eligible under HOME-ARP rental housing. So you're able to provide single family or multifamily housing, transitional or permanent supportive housing, group homes, SRO units, and manufactured housing. So to talk a little bit about targeting, we'll provide definitions of QPs, qualifying populations, in just a minute. But this is something that's unique about HOME-ARP is that, as you may know, HOME-ARP was designed to serve primarily qualifying populations, so households that meet those definitions. But one of the flexibilities that HOME-ARP provides when it comes to rental housing is that not 100% of HOME-ARP rental units need to be occupied by qualifying households, meaning those QP definitions. HOME-ARP provides for this possibility that within a portfolio of HOME-ARP units, up to 30% of those units can be restricted for low-income households that may or may not meet the QP definition. So just to flesh out this a little bit, so individual projects may vary. So you may well have a project that has more than 30% of its units restricted for occupancy by low-income households. But across PJs or participating jurisdictions, entire portfolio of HOME-ARP units, not more than 30% of those units can be restricted for low-income households that do not meet the definition of a QP. So just to reiterate, at least 70% of your HOME-ARP units across your entire PJ's portfolio must be restricted for occupancy by qualifying households. And when we're talking about qualifying populations, I'll provide a definition here briefly. It's spelled out in the notice, so please refer to that if you have questions. But essentially, we have 4 qualifying populations, the first of which are those households or individuals that are literally homeless. This follows the McKinney-Vento Act definition that you can find in Section 91.5 of Title 24 of the Code of Federal Regulations. The exception here, so if you look at the code, there will be 4 categories under the definition of homeless. For HOME-ARP purposes, for QP1 here, we're looking at the first 3 definitions. So the first 3 categories under the homeless definition will be applicable for QP number 1. The 4th category there speaks to domestic violence, and it's not included in QP1 because that's captured already in QP number 3, as we'll see in a second. The second qualifying population that's eligible for HOME-ARP units is those at risk of homelessness. Again, this follows the McKinney-Vento Act definition, and it follows it as it is written, so no exceptions here. Essentially, it encompasses folks that are earning up to 30% of AMI, that don't have sufficient support networks to prevent them from going into homelessness, and that meet a series of criteria that are laid out in the notice. And there are some additional flexibilities there for children and youth. QP number 3, as I mentioned, encompasses those that are fleeing and attempting to flee domestic violence. It also encompasses folks fleeing or attempting to flee dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. And human trafficking here, we're talking about labor and sex trafficking both. Now, the first several of these concepts come from the VAWA regulation. And the last one, human trafficking, that comes from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. So both of those regulations are combined here for this QP number 3. The 4th QP talks about other populations. Essentially, first of all, these are household individuals that do not meet a definition of any of the previous 3 QPs. If they do so, they'll be categorized into one of those first 3 QPs. But then it's designed to assist households that were previously homeless and are currently receiving some form of emergency or temporary assistance. They're keeping them housed, but they need that additional assistance to prevent their homelessness. So they need an additional HOME-ARP assistance in order to remain housed. And that's the first kind of bucket under that 4th QP. The second one is for those quote that under the greatest risk of housing instability. And that's defined a couple of different ways. It can be folks that are whose income is under 30% AMI and they are severely cost burdened, which means that at least half of their income is going towards housing costs. Or it can also be folks that are under the 50% of AMI, so area median income. So folks whose income do not exceed 50% of AMI, and that also meet a series of criteria as listed in the HOME-ARP notice. And it's important to note that veterans and families, including veteran members, they follow under whichever QP they meet the criteria for. So there's not a specific QP population for veterans, but they are able to meet any of the other categories. Now, talking about eligible activities under HOME-ARP, like I mentioned, acquisition, construction, and rehabilitation are eligible activities, and rehab includes the definition of reconstruction as defined in Part 92.2. It's important to highlight that acquisition of vacant land or demolition of an existing structure is an allowable activity, but only insofar as it's done with respect to a specific HOME-ARP project. And you must do so when you have the expectation that you're going to begin construction for that HOME-ARP project within 12 months of the commitment of the funds. And for any of these activities, acquisition, construction, rehab, the HOME-ARP project must meet the definition of project that's found in part 92.2. So I mentioned there, that there's an allowance here for a split between units that are occupied by QP households, but then there's that 30% carve out that may be occupiable by low-income households that do not meet QP definitions. Every HOME-ARP rental housing project must contain at least one QP unit per project. And the costs that can be covered by the HOME-ARP funds are those costs associated with those HOME-ARP units and their proportionate share of the common areas. So if you have a project that has 50% of those units are HOME-ARP units, then you can pay, using HOME-ARP funds, you can pay up to 50% of the cost associated with the common area. Underwriting and subsidy layering review requirements do apply for, to HOME-ARP, and cost allocation is required if the HOME-ARP assisted units are not comparable to the unassisted units in the same project. Once the project is completed, the number of HOME-ARP units that were committed at the beginning cannot go down. So you're locked into that number of HOME-ARP units. You are able to invest, as a PJ, you are able to add additional HOME-ARP funds into a project after it's constructed in a couple of different ways. First of all, ongoing operating cost assistance is a permitted use. So during the compliance period and prior to the end of the HOME-ARP budget period, again, that's September 30th of 2030, you are permitted to invest operating cost assistance into an existing project. You also have the ability to capitalize an operating reserve that will allow you to fund operating assistance over the longer term. And as far as capital costs go, the only way that you can invest HOME-ARP funds after project completion is within the first 12 months of project completion. After those 12 months have passed, investment of additional capital funds from HOME-ARP is prohibited. In terms of eligible costs, a range of costs are eligible. So development hard costs, acquisition costs of improved or unimproved real property, with a caveat there that there's acquisition costs must be tied specifically to a HOME-ARP project. The refinancing of existing debt is an eligible cost, but there are additional requirements tied to that. So if that's something that you're considering, I'd encourage you to go look at the notice for those additional requirements. Staff costs, relocation are eligible uses. Costs relating to payment of loans is an eligible cost. This is speaking to paying off, for example, a construction loan. The caveat here is that the cost that you're paying off must have been used towards eligible costs. So in my example here of a construction loan, that construction loan must have been used towards eligible HOME-ARP costs for you to be able to repay it using HOME-ARP funds. And as I've mentioned, operating cost assistance is an eligible use here for HOME-ARP. In terms of ineligible costs, those are the same as under the HOME program as listed under part 92.214, with the exception of operating cost assistance. That is a prohibited cost on the HOME program, but that prohibition has been waived for HOME-ARP. In terms of form and amount of assistance, the forms of assistance allowable are pretty varied. So equity investments are allowed, interest or non-interest bearing loans or advances are allowed, interest subsidies, deferred payment loans and grants are allowed, and you have the ability to work with HUD to approve other forms of assistance as may be interesting to you. There is a minimum amount of assistance, which is at least $1,000 of HOME-ARP funds per HOME-ARP assisted unit. So a project that has 5 HOME-ARP units, a minimum amount of assistance will be $5,000. And the maximum subsidy has been suspended for HOME-ARP. So of course, you can only pay as much as the total of eligible costs in a project, but there's no additional cap per unit on that maximum subsidy. So in other words, HOME-ARP can fund up to 100% of HOME-ARP eligible costs in a project, regardless of the number of HOME-ARP units in that project. And with that, I will switch it over to my colleague Les, who will talk about some challenges relating to HOME-ARP.
Great, thanks, Alex. So Alex has kind of laid out the basic parameters that the HOME-ARP regulations allow for you. And we're going to spend, I think, the rest of the time here kind of talking about, okay, putting that into practice and given the population that we are working on serving, what some of those challenges are going to be, and then some of the techniques that can be used to make sure that those projects are going to be sustainable, going to be a good long-term project serving the population here. So the big difference here with the HOME-ARP funds is that at least 70% of our money are supporting, providing housing for qualified population, which have very low income. And so for these units to be affordable, we're going to need, our rents are going to need to be low, or we're going to need other sources of subsidy to make sure that these projects are going to be viable. Now, in some cases, we might see projects that are debt-free as far as mortgages for creation of the facility itself. But even in those cases, depending on the mix of the population of these units, the flow of rent proceeds, net rent proceeds, might not be enough to cover operating costs. And so trying to determine that if we fund this project, that you can be confident that it will be sustainable, either through the flow, the generation of revenue from the project itself, or other sources that you've paired in with this. So we're going to be talking about some of those techniques on that. So as Alex talked about, we have a waiver on what we're used to with this maximum subsidy per unit. So the ability to more fully subsidize these projects helps to be able to have these projects potentially have very little or maybe no debt that they're trying to support throughout the affordability period on that. But also this change that one of the eligible costs under the HOME-ARP funding is the ability to provide operating cost assistance. And so that's going to be, some of those sources are going to be really critical to be able to stabilize that project. So, our challenges are how do we make it sustainable? We're going to have upfront a higher capital investment in many cases to try to either reduce or eliminate that long-term debt. That doesn't necessarily handle then all of our operating costs, but it does help reduce what those fixed costs that we need to be able to cover for that project. And we're also going to be talking a bit about, and I think probably what you will, if you were looking at HOME-ARP projects, I think you will see that many of them are planned to be mixed income developments. And that might be, Alex talked about the fact that 70% of our units are for qualified population, but the other 30 can go for LMI populations. But we also could mix those HOME-ARP units in with the project that maybe had tax credit units or might be market rate units. And so some of those units that are bringing in a higher flow of rent being paid in may help to offset some of the costs for those more restricted HOME-ARP units and be able to help cover those operating costs on that. And so, as Alex was pointing out, some of these flexibilities that were built into the HOME-ARP funding requirements have been put in place specifically to try to help with these projects to allow you to fund them and ensure that they're going to be sustainable throughout that affordability period. So we want to talk a little bit about operating cost assistance and what is it that we're talking about when we mention that. So it really is covering that shortfall between what your expenses are and the revenue that's coming in from rent and if there are any other sources of revenue for that project. And so because of our restricted rents, we are going to have, in many cases, less rent revenue that's coming in compared to the cost of either debt or operating costs for that project. So these reserves, operating cost assistance, can be used to then cover that shortfall as that occurs. And so to be able to determine what is eligible to be withdrawn from our operating cost assistance, and we'll talk about a couple of ways that that assistance could be provided. Since we're covering the gap, we're going to have to be able to track what are our expenses, back out any income that's coming in being generated from rents, to then determine what is that gap or shortfall, and that's the amount that is going to be eligible to be withdrawn from that reserve. And this is this flexibility in operating cost assistance is only for those qualifying population units. So that it may be as few as 70% of our QP units, our HOME-ARP units, are going to be part of that QP set aside for that project. So we're going to spend a goodly amount of time talking about the underwriting process to try to determine what is the need for operating cost assistance, what do we expect to see over the life of that project, of that shortfall, and then planning to make sure that we have resources in place that will be able to cover whatever shortfall that might be. And so as part of our operating cost assistance, as always with all of our use of federal dollars, we need to make sure that the costs are reasonable and appropriate for the area, for the size of the structure, and of course the population that's being served. So as we mentioned, it needs to be reasonable and necessary, but let's talk about some of the things that get included in that. So, part of our cost of operating an affordable housing project would include the administrative oversight. So, the staff that's going to manage that property, payroll, any sort of training or travel that's related to that work, and then the goods and services that might be needed as part of that. We may have day-to-day property management fees that are being paid. And so the portion that would be related to our qualifying population units, our QP units, would be eligible for our operating cost assistance based on whatever that gap had been determined to be. And then keep in mind, of course, not only do we have ongoing maintenance, but we hopefully have reserves in place that are specifically for operating and maintenance needs over the life of that project. And so many of our projects will have a set pay-in to that reserve that will need to be done on an annual basis. And so that's an expense that's related to those QP units. And so that would also be a cost that would be eligible to be paid using that operating cost assistance. And so that replacement reserve is something that's then used to cover as any of your major systems reach the end of their useful life. So, at some point, probably every refrigerator, every water heater will need to be replaced, but then things like HVAC, roofing systems, those sorts of things all have a useful life and will have need to be replaced at some point. And so trying to project and make sure that we have enough operating cost assistance, including covering those costs, becomes essential to ensure that that property will remain sustainable as those costs might be incurred during the affordability period. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how this can be provided. So you essentially have two options on this. It could be provided in the terms of an ongoing operating cost assistance that could be funded as part of that project. But we also could, on the front end of that project, capitalize a reserve account. So essentially draw funds that get placed in a separate interest-bearing account. And the sizing of that account, that reserve that's created, would need to be based on your underwriting, looking at what we expect the revenue from rents, what we expect those costs to be. So you're making a projection of what we think that shortfall would be, that gap in operating for costs for that project, and that reserve would be sized based on that. And as Alex mentioned, for our providing ongoing operating costs, we do have the ability during that affordability period to go back and add additional funds. So I would guess that you're going to see PJs in some cases choose to, instead of capitalizing with one large sum of money that's going to come out directly out of available funds, that they will do that over time so that they're not tying up as many funds at the beginning of these projects to fund costs that are going to perhaps occur much later in that project's life. And so, as Alex mentioned, the end date that we have to be able to have this be an eligible use of our HOME-ARP funds is going to be September 30th of 2030. So that's essentially the end of the HOME-ARP period. And so we can't budget and allocate funds for expenses that would be incurred potentially by that project beyond that September 30th of 2030 date. If at the end of our affordability period, our compliance period for that project, we find that there are still dollars sitting in that capitalized operating reserve account, those must be returned to the PJ. Because they are HOME-ARP dollars, they're going to be treated as program income because they're coming back to the PJ. We know that any payments coming back to the PJ are going to be tagged as program income. And they will hold their federal identity as home program income and need to follow and be reused accordingly. If our project is going to continue to serve our qualifying population after the end of their affordability period, they could remain in place. But I would presume that we're going to have some projects that at the end of that compliance period, those restrictions will go away. And so at the point that the restriction of those units being occupied and serving the QP population, then those capitalized reserve funds will need to go back to the PJ. Let's talk a little bit about oversight and management. So the PJ is the recipient of the HOME-ARP funds. And so they're going to be responsible to make sure that the oversight of that project, making sure that it is being appropriately managed, that the project continues to meet the HOME-ARP and other overlay of other federal requirements is going to be the responsibility of the PJ. That might be a subrecipient or someone working on their behalf, but ultimately that responsibility lies with the PJ. So we will be talking about, the PJ needs to be really diligent in making sure that when they decide to fund a project, that they've reviewed it adequately, they've analyzed the partners that are going to be handling some of those key actions over the life of the project, and the financial underwriting that we're going to talk a little bit more about, to make sure that if we fund it, not only is there a market for this, we're going to be able to serve that population, but that it's going to remain financially viable over the required affordability period for that. So as always, we're going to have written agreements in place that will be executed for each of these projects prior to the HOME-ARP funds being begin to disperse those. And that will lock in that project owner layout for that property manager, what all of those requirements are going to be, particularly since we're dealing with rental requirements, thinking over the life of that project, who's eligible to live there, what would be the maximum rent that could be charged. All of that needs to be very carefully laid out within the written agreement. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Let's focus a little bit. I know I keep talking about sustainability and underwriting, so let's kind of talk a little bit about, well, what are we looking at when we are conducting underwriting and subsidy layering? So first off, we're determining what are all the sources of funding and all the uses. We want to make sure what's the total amount of funding that's going to be needed to develop this project, and then do we actually have firm commitments of all that funding? When is it available? Do we have any gaps of, we will eventually have those funds available, but they're not, during the development phase, maybe they're not available until the unit has been completed. So we're going through that sources and uses analysis, making sure everything has been accounted for and that we have adequate funding committed to this to be able to complete that. We also always have to look at not only cost reasonableness. So, would a prudent person, is this an appropriate cost that they will be paying for each of these elements within the proposed budget? But then also looking at, for the subsidy that we're providing, is the profit that's going to be derived from this by the owner or developer, is that reasonable? That may be part of then, as part of our underwriting, the determination on, will this be a loan versus a grant? What are the terms of that loan? Will we recoup some of that so that we haven't, over enhanced the profit that's going to be received by the owner on that property? And really key, of course, on all of our housing, and particularly for our HOME-ARP, is to be thinking about what's the market demand? Where do these units need to be? What's the size and type of unit that's needed? So if we build them, are we confident that there's going to be a market for those, not only today for that initial rent up, but also thinking about what do we see happening in that area, population-wise, demographic-wise, for the population that we are targeting, to ensure that this is the right size, this is the right placement and type of project on them. It's going to be really critical to make sure that these units continue and not only rent up, but also continue to serve our target population based on doing some study on that market itself. We're going to really depend on that developer to have the appropriate experience and capacity and financial stability to be able to complete that project. And so, as would be typical for all of our home development projects, that underwriting is going to need to also include looking at that developer experience and capacity, in particular with this type of project that's being proposed, to make sure that they have the right team assembled, and that, maybe based on all of the other projects that they've been funded for, that they have the capacity to be able to complete that. And that includes not only their financial stability, but when we talk about financial commitments, we want to make sure that of all of the sources of funding that are listed as part of our underwriting, that they're not just applied for or conditionally approved. We need to know that they've been committed to this project. So if we begin to invest HOME-ARP funding in this, we need to make sure that all of those other sources that are going to be required to complete the project and be able to have it fulfill its affordability period are actually committed for this project. So as part of our project, we mentioned about looking at all of the multiple funding sources. I think in many cases, as we oftentimes see in home development, that projects are put together, layering together multiple funding sources. So LIHTC is low-income housing tax credits, but project-based rental subsidy or voucher. So we talked about the fact that we're going to have a population that in affordable rent is going to be pretty limited. And so the ability to generate enough revenue to cover the expenses for operating that property, having access to project-based subsidies or vouchers that are committed to that population, to its occupants of that property, will go a long way towards making that property sustainable long term. In the absence of those other subsidies being adequate, then we also have operating cost assistance that we talked about either being capitalized or being funded as ongoing cost assistance on that to make sure that the numbers will actually work. And one of the things I'll just point out here, I think people sometimes think about, I'm just looking at the sources and uses on building the structure, or maybe I'm looking at operating for just the first couple of years. That underwriting needs to cover the entire compliance period, that entire affordability period, which is a minimum of 15 years. And so we are also, as part of that underwriting, making a projection of what do we see happening over time? Will our rent levels, the income coming in from rent, go up, particularly if we've got a mixed project where maybe we have market rate units or other units in that property? How do we project those rents being increased over time? But also thinking about all of the expenses that are happening now. If we've got private mortgage, should be locked into what our debt expenses are going to be. But things like the cost of utilities, or taxes, insurance, we're probably going to expect to rise over time. And so part of that underwriting throughout the compliance period is projecting how we think those costs will escalate over time, so that we can not only looking at year one, but for each year throughout that affordability period, make a projection of revenue versus expenses and determine whether that project is going to be sustainable. And we said that our operating cost assistance can be filling that gap. So if there's a shortfall, and so part of that projecting those costs and revenue over the life of that project is calculating over those years what's the amount of operating cost assistance that would be needed. And we're not going to fund that project unless we can show that either through the sources of that project itself or through a capital subsidy for reserves or providing ongoing operating cost assistance, that we can verify that, yes, this project is going to remain viable. It's going to be able to complete its affordability period in serving the population that it's required to serve under the HOME-ARP rules. So the PJ is required to have written underwriting guidelines. It's similar to regular home. And so as part of that, we're again going to make sure that all of the sources and uses are in place and firmly committed, and that all costs are necessary and reasonable. I mentioned about looking at market demand, so that's looking at the number of qualifying households for this. Also, depending on how our units have been designated, low-income households for that. We talked already about developer experience and financial capacity, and also this issue about making sure that all of those commitments are actually finalized and we have firm financial commitments. So we might, with our HOME-ARP underwriting, we might have a project that included, let's say, tax credits. And so we might be making, for our HOME-ARP funds, we might be making a conditional or an initial review determining that the project was eligible, but we wouldn't be able to complete our final underwriting and make that final commitment of our HOME-ARP funds until we had been able to document that all of those sources had been committed, that we had final numbers of what that the amount of that source would be, so we could then determine that we've done all of our due diligence and that this was a viable project that was going to be sustainable throughout that affordability period. So PJ's responsibilities. Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about the underwriting on this, and this is really an important step to be able to cover the risk for that PJ. So if we have a project that is not able to complete that affordability period that goes with the use of those funds, then the PJ would be responsible for repayment of those funds. So we want to make sure that that due diligence of doing good underwriting, carefully projecting costs out over the affordability period for that project has been done, and that we have then established any needed subsidies, whether it's project-based vouchers that are going to make that viable, or whether we have reserves that are being closed. I already mentioned the issue about, until these other sources have been finalized, we're not able to finalize our HOME-ARP underwriting. Then we might do something, we might have a conditional ruling on this, but really can't finalize it and execute that agreement until we can finalize. And of course, as part of that review, we're not only making sure that it's financially viable, but also reviewing all of the HOME-ARP requirements and making sure that those also are going to be met by the project as it's been proposed. The PJ must do their own underwriting on this. They might review the underwriting that was done by other lenders. That might include low-income housing tax credits. But as I mentioned, for HOME-ARP, they need to have their own underwriting guidelines and standards. And so they will need to underwrite this project based on their standards. So for sustainability, we've talked quite a bit already about this long-term financial viability. And again, it needs to meet the entire compliance period on it. So that may vary project by project on what that designated affordability period would be. As part of that, we mentioned the fact that those reserves also may be covering those capital replacements, and that might include the payments that are being made on an annual basis on behalf of those QP units. And that would be part of a capital needs assessment to determine, over the life of this project, over the affordability period, what are capital replacements that I expect to have? So, if I have a boiler system that we've determined has another 10 years of useful life, but we have a 15-year affordability period, then we would be projecting that somewhere around year 10, we're going to have this expense of replacing the boiler system. So we need to make sure that our reserves are adequate to cover that. And so it's the PJ's responsibility to make sure that not only it will survive long-term based on these known capital needs, but also any kind of moderate loss of revenue or higher costs than we're projected. We don't want these to be so tightly underwritten that any unexpected less money coming in or more money going out would put them in peril. We're trying to not over-subsidize these, but we also need to make sure they have a little bit of flexibility so that they can sustain some unexpected cost or loss of revenue. So related requirements to this, we have talked a little bit about cost allocation. We're going to talk about written agreements, commitments, project completion deadlines, a little bit about our property standards, and then our rent and utility allowances and our compliance periods. Let's jump through a few of these. So for the home commitment requirement, similar to what we have in regular home, there needs to be a legally binding written agreement in place between the PJ and the project owner. And because this is a HOME-ARP project, it also needs to reflect those HOME-ARP specific requirements. And that would be put in place at the point that all of the financing have been secured, that the budget and the schedule were in place, that the underwriting have been completed. And with that, there is a requirement, as we're familiar with regular homes, that construction must begin, it's scheduled to begin within 12 months of the date of that written agreement. So part of that schedule that's been established is evaluating if we fund this today, are they within 12 months of being able to get started with this project? So because we probably will have many of our projects are going to be a mix of HOME-ARP and other restrictions on funding, on units, we need to make sure that that written agreement is really carefully laid out and specifically lays out which of these units are going to be our HOME-ARP units. So as Alex mentioned, we have a restriction on at least 70% of our units being set aside for our qualifying population. The balance of our HOME-ARP units could be for low-income households. So that written agreement needs to specify what's the number of total HOME-ARP units, what are the number of the qualifying population versus low income for that. And we would expect then to see those over the life of the project, that the rents, the population that are occupying them are going to match what we have defined as part of that. With that also would be laying out how those are going to be handled over time. So the HOME program, as you may be familiar with, has a designation of either fixed or floating. So if it's fixed, we would designate particular units in the project or property and say, these are our home units. These are always going to be the units that will have the HOME-ARP units attached with them where we expect to have our qualifying populations. There is also the flexibility, as we have in home, to set this up as a floating. So let's say we have 6 HOME-ARP 2-bedroom units within a 40-unit complex. So if we designate this as floating, we're always going to, throughout the life of the project, expect that there are going to be 6 units that are qualifying, meeting all of the HOME-ARP requirements, but they could be floating around. They could be switched to different units over time as populations change, as incomes change, and people move in and out of that property. So that would be part of that upfront determination of, do I want these to be fixed or floating? And then that's what we're going to follow throughout that compliance period to ensure and document that we're in compliance with our unit designation on them. So our written procedures for all of our underwriting, our subsidy layering needs to be in place. That will be carefully documented in the file. That would be something that would be monitored, and that would include all of that backup documentation, notations on dates to be able to show when things were done. And we mentioned that each PJ needs to have written underwriting standards, and so making sure that all that documentation is in line with what you called out as, this is going to be my standard, lead to the steps that I'm going to go through. Keep in mind, this last bullet point is about recognizing that over the life of a project, we may see some changes that are made. So Alex mentioned that in that first year of the project being in place, we could still have eligibility to put in additional HOME-ARP dollars. So maybe we've completed the project, we began the rent-up process, and we determined that there is something that needs to be done for this project that wasn't originally included in our original budget. We might see some additional funding added. If we did that, then because we've determined the level of our investment and the number of units we're designated following this underwriting process, when those changes occur, we'll have to go back through and review, make sure that what we defined within our underwriting is still valid. If it's changed, we will then need to update that written agreement to match that. So it's a living document that over time would be updated as needed. So at any point, an auditor or someone else coming in would be able to pull that written agreement, and they would be able to see as it had been amended. So what they're seeing on site with the project is going to match what was promised or guaranteed as part of that written agreement. So I'm going to turn things over to Alex and let you talk a little bit about resources. Alex, you might be muted. Looks like we're maybe having a little technical issue. I can go ahead and talk through this. So just wanted to point out some resources that are available as part of this. So at HUD.gov, there are FAQs, frequently asked questions, related to the HOME-ARP program. Those will be built out over time. So that might be something to keep an eye on and revisit to see if there are new questions and new guidance that's been provided. There also is on the HUD Exchange, there is a landing page that is on the HUD Exchange. And so sort of everything related to the HOME-ARP program is located there. We have a note here about the rental housing underwriting tool. That's something that's currently underway in development. That's kind of, I think, in final stages. So keep an eye on, that would be something that would be posted on the HOME-ARP HUD Exchange page. And then we'll mention for the HUD Exchange, it allows you to sign up and designate programs that you want to be notified about when there are changes or additional guidance. And so that might be, you may want to add that to your list so that when things like the rental underwriting tool are released, that you would receive notification about them. That brings us to the end of our webinar on this. We hope that this has been helpful for you. There are additional webinars that will be part of this series. We've been covering the development period, but there also is sort of a companion webinar that will be posted, I think at probably about the same time, covering the compliance period for our home unit. So stay tuned, look for those. Those would be posted on the HUD Exchange, and hopefully we'll provide a useful resource for you. So with that, I think we will thank everybody for their participation, and hope this is a useful training for you. Thanks, everybody.